Before the US Constitution, there were the Articles of Confederation, the first blueprint for American self-government. Born from revolution, the Articles aimed to unite 13 independent states under a fragile alliance. Drafted during the chaos of war, they balanced the need for cooperation with a deep fear of centralized power. The process was slow debate, compromise, and the challenge of getting all 13 states to agree. Only in 1781, after years of wrangling, did the Articles become law, just as the war neared its end. For a brief but critical period, this document guided the new nation through war and into a precarious peace. The Articles' legacy, a necessary first step and a lesson in the limits of unity. The American Revolution forced 13 distinct colonies to act as one. They needed a central authority to raise armies, negotiate with foreign powers, and coordinate the war effort. The Continental Congress filled this role, but without legal authority, it was little more than a committee. A written constitution would legitimize Congress at home and abroad, signaling to France and Spain that America was a real nation. The Articles of Confederation became both a tool for internal unity and a diplomatic passport. Without them, foreign aid and perhaps victory would have been impossible. The Articles were as much about survival as about ideals. The Articles created a firm league of friendship, not a strong nation. States kept their sovereignty, lending only limited powers to Congress, mainly for war and diplomacy. The central government couldn't tax, regulate trade, or enforce laws. It relied on the states' goodwill. This alliance was designed to prevent tyranny, reflecting deep distrust of centralized authority. Unity abroad was essential, but at home, local control reigned supreme. The system worked barely during crisis, but its weaknesses soon became clear. The experiment in loose confederation set the stage for future change. Ratifying the Articles required all 13 states to agree, a process that dragged on for years. Most states signed quickly, but Maryland refused, demanding Western lands be shared by all, not claimed by a few. The war effort hung in the balance as states argued over land and power. Only when Virginia and New York ceded their claims did Maryland relent. In 1781, the Articles finally became law, uniting the states, at least on paper. The struggle for ratification revealed both the promise and the peril of state sovereignty. The League of Friendship was real but fragile. In 1776, as independence was declared, a committee of 13, one from each colony, was tasked with designing a government. Led by John Dickinson, they debated how much power to give Congress versus the states. Dickinson's draft called for a stronger central government, but most delegates feared repeating British tyranny. The final proposal reflected compromise, a weak Congress, strong states. The committee's work was groundbreaking, but shaped by distrust of authority. Their solution was bold but imperfect, a government that could unite but not command. The Articles were a product of their revolutionary moment. The biggest debates, representation and taxation. Large states wanted votes based on population. Small states insisted on equality. One state, one vote, one out. Dickinson's plan for federal taxes was rejected. Instead, Congress could only request money from states. These choices protected state power, but left the central government weak and often broke. The Articles embodied the revolutionaries' fear of distant authority. The result? A union that struggled to act as one, even in crisis. The lessons of these debates would shape the next, stronger constitution. The Articles of Confederation, approved in 1777, balanced competing interests and reflected the political realities of the time. The drafters sought to coordinate war efforts and foreign policy, while leaving domestic matters to the states. The government consisted of the Congress of the Confederation, where each state had one vote. Congress could declare war, make treaties, but lacked the power to tax or regulate commerce. This weakness, born of fear of centralized power, became the Confederation's greatest challenge. Once Congress finalized the draft in November of 1777, the Articles of Confederation embarked on the next stage of their journey ratification. The document was sent to the legislatures of the 13 states, with a request for their unanimous consent. This was, well, truly the moment of truth. The delegates in Congress had found a way to agree, But would the states themselves follow suit? The process that unfolded was a slow, staggered affair, revealing the complex political landscape of the young nation. Each state legislature became a new forum for debate as local leaders weighed the benefits of union against the perceived costs to their own power and interests. The first states to ratify did so with a sense of urgency. Virginia, the largest and most influential state, led the way, giving its approval on December 16, 1777, just 1 month after receiving the document. In early 1778, a wave of other states followed. South Carolina, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Georgia, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts all ratified within a few months. These states, many of them on the front lines of the war, understood the critical need for a functioning national government. They recognized that without a formal legal union, the war effort could easily collapse into chaos and disarray. For them, the Articles were an imperfect but necessary tool for survival. However, not all states were so quick to agree. The process slowed considerably as the remaining states raised serious objections. New Jersey, for instance, was concerned about the economic implications of the new system. Without a central government to regulate commerce, New Jersey feared it would be at the mercy of its larger neighbors, New York and Pennsylvania, which could impose tariffs on goods passing through their ports. Delaware expressed similar concerns. These smaller states felt vulnerable and argued that the Articles did not do enough to create a level economic playing field for all members of the Union. Despite these reservations, both New Jersey and Delaware eventually came around. After proposing a series of amendments that were ultimately rejected by Congress, they recognized that the need for unity outweighed their specific grievances. New Jersey ratified in November of 1778, and Delaware followed suit in early 1779. By the spring of 1779, 12 of the 13 states had given their approval. The firm League of Friendship was on the cusp of becoming a reality, but the rule of unanimity meant that the entire structure, approved by 12 sovereign states, was now held in limbo by the refusal of just one, the small but resolute state of Maryland. Maryland's refusal to join the Confederation stemmed from a concern about control of western lands. States like Virginia held vast claims to territories west of the Appalachian Mountains. Maryland feared being dominated by these powerful states. They argued western lands were won through common effort and should be common property. Maryland demanded claimant states cede these territories to Congress. This became a non-negotiable condition for Maryland's ratification, threatening the Union. War pressures and French allies led to land cessions. Virginia promised cession, leading Maryland to ratify in 1781. The process was finally over. The Articles of Confederation designed a confederacy, a formal alliance of 13 independent states. The document consisted of 13 articles establishing a single-chamber Congress. There was no president or national court system. Power flowed upwards from the states, with Congress handling limited tasks like diplomacy and defense. Decision-making was slow, requiring state consensus. This structure created challenges when the nation needed swift, unified action. The opening articles set the stage, establishing the identity and power dynamics of the new political entity. Article 1 gives the Confederacy its name, the United States of America. Article 2 defined the soul of the Confederation. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. This made it clear that the states were not surrendering their authority. The language was a direct response to the American experience with British rule. This meant that Congress could not claim any implied powers. This ensured that the states remained the principal centers of political life. The United States was a league of 13 small republics. The Articles defined the Union as a firm league of friendship among the states. The states entered into this league for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare. This league of friendship was primarily an outward-facing security pact. Article 4 then shifts to the relationship between their people, stipulating that the free inhabitants of each state were entitled to all the privileges and immunities of free citizens in the other states. It ensured that people and their property could move freely between the states. Together, Articles 3 and 4 formed the connective tissue of the Confederation. Article 5 delves into the mechanics of the central government itself, outlining the composition and rules of the Congress of the Confederation. It established a system that was fundamentally different from the bicameral, population-based legislature that would later be created by the Constitution. Under the Articles, the principle of state equality was paramount. The article dictated that each state, regardless of its size, wealth or population, would have one single vote in Congress. This was a continuation of the practice that had been used in the Continental Congress and represented a major victory for the smaller states, who feared being dominated by their larger neighbours like Virginia, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. To exercise this single vote, each state was entitled to send a delegation of between 2 and 7 members to Congress. The state legislatures were given the power to appoint these delegates annually and could also recall them at any time if they were displeased with their performance. This provision ensured that the delegates remained closely tied to the state governments that sent them, rather than developing an independent identity as national politicians. Furthermore, the article placed strict term limits on the delegates, stipulating that no person could serve as a delegate for more than 3 years in any 6-year period, a measure designed to prevent the emergence of a permanent political class. The procedures for voting within Congress were also carefully defined to protect the interests of the states. While a state had only one collective vote, its delegation could be internally divided. If a state's delegates were evenly split on an issue, that state's vote would not be counted. This often meant that delegations had to caucus and reach an internal consensus before casting their state's official vote. This complex process further slowed down deliberations, but it was seen as a necessary safeguard. The entire system was designed to force compromise and ensure that decisions were not made hastily, but with the careful consideration and broad agreement of the member states. This structure, one state, one vote, was the ultimate expression of the Confederation's nature as an alliance of sovereign entities. Virginia, with a population more than 10 times that of Delaware, had the exact same amount of power in the halls of Congress. While this protected the small states, it also created a significant democratic deficit. The interests of a majority of the American people could theoretically be blocked by a small number of delegates from sparsely populated states. This imbalance and the inefficiencies it created would become a major point of criticism and a key driver for the eventual push to reform the national government a few years later. Articles 6, 7 and 8 addressed foreign policy, military affairs and government funding. Article 6 centralized foreign relations, preventing states from making treaties without congressional consent. States couldn't engage in war without permission, but were required to maintain a well-regulated militia. Article 7 gave states authority to appoint officers below the rank of general. Article 8 stipulated that expenses would be paid from a common treasury, supplied by the states based on land value. Congress couldn't compel states to pay, a flaw that crippled the Confederation's finances. Article 9 details the powers delegated to Congress, including determining peace and war. Congress had the authority to enter treaties, regulate coinage, and establish a post office. However, exercising these powers required a supermajority. The approval of at least 9 of the 13 states was required for significant actions. This ensured Congress could not act without widespread consensus. Life under the Articles of Confederation saw the United States with a central government on paper, yet in practice, this government was largely impotent. The fundamental challenge was the profound weakness of the central authority. The Confederation Congress could pass laws, but had absolutely no mechanism to enforce them. There was no national executive branch to carry out the laws, and no national judiciary to compel compliance. This created a system where the government's authority was entirely dependent on the voluntary goodwill of the states, especially as the unifying urgency of the war began to fade. The government's inability to stabilize the economy, protect its borders, or enforce its own treaties created a climate of uncertainty. The Articles of Confederation's greatest weakness was the central government's lack of taxing authority. Congress couldn't pay its debts from the Revolutionary War. Article 8 left taxes to the states, who often didn't comply with Congress's requests. This system was a catastrophic failure, leaving the national treasury perpetually empty. The government couldn't pay soldiers or its debts, damaging its reputation. A proposal to levy a 5% tax on imported goods failed because it required unanimous consent. A single state, Rhode Island or New York, could doom any measure. The Articles of Confederation's flaws were dangerously apparent in military affairs. Congress lacked the power to create a national army. It had to requisition soldiers from the states, proving inadequate. Washington pleaded for men and supplies. The army was perpetually short of everything. Starving, freezing soldiers at Valley Forge exemplified this suffering. The Newburgh conspiracy threatened a military coup. Washington diffused it, but the problem remained. Military weakness was a national vulnerability. The nation was left with virtually no standing army. The Articles' solution proved unworkable, leaving the nation exposed. Under the Articles of Confederation, the government couldn't regulate commerce. States acted like rival countries, imposing tariffs on each other, creating trade wars. New York taxed New Jersey and Connecticut, who retaliated with boycotts. Without national policies, European powers exploited the situation. This chaos highlighted the need for a stronger central government. Leaders like Madison and Hamilton argued for a national authority to regulate trade. The experience showed that a commercial republic needed a government to manage trade for the nation's benefit. The weakness of the United States was painfully obvious. Congress's inability to back up its words with money or military force rendered it ineffective. A glaring example was the failure to enforce the Treaty of Paris. The British refused to leave forts in the Northwest Territory, citing America's failures to restore Loyalist property and ensure debt collection. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American commerce, devastating Western farmers. American ships were seized by Barbary pirates, and the US could afford neither tribute nor military action. This made it clear that a nation that could not defend its own interests would never be treated as an equal. The Confederation Congress struggled with a mundane problem: getting enough delegates to show up. Official business required a quorum of at least 7 states. These rules often paralyzed the government. The national legislature was often absent, travel was difficult, and many leaders preferred serving in their state governments. This quorum problem had consequences, notably in ratifying the Treaty of Paris. For weeks, Congress lacked the 9 states needed to approve it. This demonstrated the central government's weakness and inability to operate effectively. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress elected a president from its members. This President of the United States in Congress assembled was merely a moderator of the legislative body. 10 men held this office, serving 1-year terms. They could not veto legislation or command the army. The limitations reflected revolutionary fear of executive power. This experience demonstrated the need for a separate and energetic executive branch. It is easy to focus solely on the negatives of the Articles of Confederation: the empty treasury, commercial chaos, and military weakness. However, this government managed to produce visionary legislation. It found surprising success when it turned its attention to the vast, untamed wilderness to the west. It transformed this contested region into a national domain owned by all the states collectively. In a series of landmark ordinances, the Congress laid out a systematic plan for westward expansion. It established foundational principles of land distribution, governance, and civil rights. The Land Ordinance of 1785 was a solution to turn a vast wilderness into saleable land. The goal was to raise revenue and avoid chaotic land-grabbing practices. The ordinance established a revolutionary system of land survey. The territory was divided into a grid of 6-mile square townships, then into 36 smaller sections. This system imposed a uniform pattern on the land. Section 16 in each township was reserved for public schools, a remarkable act of foresight that laid the foundation for the American public education system. The Land Ordinance of 1785 divided the West, and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 governed it. This legislation addressed westward expansion, establishing a process for territories to become states. The ordinance applied to the territory north of the Ohio River, which would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Statehood was a three-stage process. This ensured the nation would be an expanding republic of equals, not a colonial empire. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in the territory. The ordinance also included a Bill of Rights, guaranteeing religious freedom and trial by jury. Together, the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 represent a monumental achievement in public policy. They were the Confederation's answer to one of the most pressing questions of the age: how a republic could expand its territory without losing its soul. These laws provided a clear, orderly, and philosophically coherent framework for westward expansion. They translated the abstract ideals of the Revolution, republicanism, liberty, and equality, into a practical program for national growth. The system they created was so successful and so sound that it would be adapted and used to guide the settlement of the rest of the American continent from the Mississippi River all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The ordinances had a profound impact on the physical and social character of the United States. The grid system of the 1785 law stamped a rational, geometric pattern across the Midwest, creating the familiar checkerboard landscape of farms and roads that still defines the region to this day. The promise of public education helped foster a culture of learning and civic engagement in the new territories. The process for statehood created a dynamic and expanding union, ensuring the nation would grow peacefully and democratically. These were not minor accomplishments. They were foundational acts of nation-building that occurred under a government often remembered only for its weaknesses. Crucially, the prohibition of slavery in the Northwest Territory had enormous long-term consequences. It created a clear geographical and political dividing line between free and slave territory along the Ohio River. This decision helped to contain the institution of slavery, at least for a time, and ensured that a large and powerful bloc of free states would develop in the nation's heartland. This would prove to be critically important in the political struggles of the 19th century and ultimately in the Civil War. The moral courage shown by the Confederation Congress in this single act would resonate for generations, shaping the great conflict that would redefine the meaning of freedom in America. In the final analysis, the story of the Articles of Confederation is incomplete without acknowledging these successes. They demonstrate that the leaders of the era were capable of more than just reacting to crises. They were capable of proactive, visionary governance. The land ordinances were a triumph of long-term planning over short-term political squabbling. They solved the problem of the West, established a lasting legacy of orderly settlement and civil rights, and provided a powerful argument for the utility of a national government. While the Articles themselves would soon be replaced, these landmark achievements would be carried forward, becoming a permanent and celebrated part of the American experiment. By the mid-1780s, the initial optimism of the American Revolution had given way to a grim reality. The firm League of Friendship was proving to be neither firm nor friendly. The weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation were causing real harm to the young nation. The government's inability to manage its finances had created a downward spiral of economic depression and political instability. A sense of crisis began to grip the country. The great experiment in self-government seemed to be teetering on the edge of failure. The nation was approaching a critical tipping point. It was becoming clear to a growing number of influential Americans that something had to change. The question was whether the Articles could be repaired, or if a more radical solution was needed. In the winter of 1786, discontent boiled over in western Massachusetts. Revolutionary War veterans, crushed by debt and taxes, faced losing their farms. Led by Daniel Shays, they took up arms demanding debt relief. The rebellion began with protests, shutting down courthouses. It exposed the weakness of the central government under the Articles of Confederation. Though the rebellion was suppressed, it served as a wake-up call. It highlighted the need for a stronger government to ensure stability and secure liberty. The aftermath of Shays' rebellion created a deep and pervasive crisis of confidence throughout the United States. The uprising had been more than just a local protest. It had been a symptom of a much larger disease afflicting the body politic. It revealed the fragility of the Republican experiment and raised a terrifying question: could a government by the people actually survive? The rebellion seemed to validate the warnings of European monarchists, who had long predicted that the American experiment in self-rule would inevitably descend into mob rule and chaos. For the founding generation, who had risked everything on the ideal of an ordered liberty, this was a moment of profound doubt and introspection. The news of the armed farmers in Massachusetts spread like wildfire, alarming property owners and political leaders in every state. George Washington, in his retirement at Mount Vernon, was deeply shaken. In letters to his friends and colleagues, he expressed his grave fears for the future of the country. He wrote that the United States was, quote, fast verging to anarchy and confusion. For Washington and many others, the rebellion demonstrated that liberty without a strong, effective government to provide order and stability was not liberty at all. It was merely a license for everyone to do as they pleased, a path that led directly to the destruction of society. This crisis of confidence eroded what little authority the Confederation Congress still commanded. The government had been exposed as a, quote, shadow without the substance, as Washington put it. It could not pay its debts, it could not defend its borders, and now it could not even keep the peace among its own citizens. Respect for the national government, both at home and abroad, plummeted to an all-time low. The situation fueled a growing sense of urgency among a group of nationalist-minded leaders, including James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. They believed that the nation was at a crossroads and that immediate decisive action was needed to avert disaster. This widespread fear and anxiety became the political engine for change. It created a climate where radical reform, once unthinkable, now seemed not only possible, but essential for survival. The Articles of Confederation, once celebrated as a bulwark against tyranny, were now increasingly seen as the source of the nation's problems. The debate was no longer about small tweaks or minor amendments. The crisis of confidence sparked by Shays' rebellion pushed the nation's leaders to consider a complete overhaul of the American system of government. The road to a new constitution was being paved with the fear of national collapse. Even before the shock of Shays' rebellion, the movement for reform was already quietly gaining momentum. The initial impetus came not from a concern over rebellion, but from the paralyzing issue of commerce. In 1785, Virginia and Maryland had successfully negotiated an agreement to resolve trade and navigation disputes on the Potomac River. This small-scale success inspired James Madison of Virginia to think bigger. He reasoned that if 2 states could solve their commercial problems, perhaps all 13 could. He proposed a meeting of all the states to discuss the commercial chaos plaguing the nation and to consider a uniform system of commercial regulations for the entire Confederation. The proposed meeting, known as the Annapolis Convention, was scheduled for September 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland. The official goal was modest and strictly limited to matters of trade. However, for reformers like Madison and Alexander Hamilton of New York, it was a strategic first step. They hoped that a discussion about commerce would inevitably lead to a broader conversation about the fundamental weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. They saw the convention as a way to gather like-minded leaders from across the country and build a coalition for more fundamental structural changes to the government. It was a subtle but brilliant political maneuver. The convention itself, however, was a disappointment on the surface. Only 12 delegates from 5 states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia, bothered to attend. The other states either declined the invitation or their delegates failed to arrive in time. With such a poor showing, the delegates present knew they lacked the legitimacy to make any meaningful recommendations on trade. The convention seemed destined to be a complete failure, another example of the state's indifference to national problems. It was a deeply discouraging moment for the reformers who had placed so much hope in the gathering. But from this apparent failure, Hamilton and Madison snatched a victory. Instead of disbanding in frustration, the small group of delegates decided to use their platform to make a much bolder proposal. Led by Hamilton, they drafted a report that was sent to the Confederation Congress and to all the state legislatures. The report argued that the nation's problems were too deep and interconnected to be solved by addressing commerce alone. It called for another convention to be held the following May in Philadelphia, with a much broader mandate to revise the Articles of Confederation and to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. This was the call to action that would change history. The call for a convention in Philadelphia was a bold gamble, met with skepticism by the Confederation Congress. News of Shays's rebellion created urgency, proving the national government was failing. In February 1787, Congress endorsed the convention, instructing delegates to revise the Articles of Confederation. Distinguished leaders like Washington, Franklin, and Madison were appointed. Gathering in Philadelphia, the delegates realized amending the Articles wasn't enough. They made a momentous decision to draft a new constitution, setting aside their instructions. The road to the United States Constitution had begun. The Articles of Confederation bear the signatures of 48 men, delegates from the 13 newly independent states. These are the forgotten signers who endorsed America's first Constitution. They were patriots who guided the country through the final years of the Revolutionary War and into a fragile peace. Their signatures represent an act of faith in a deeply uncertain time. Among them were John Hancock and Robert Morris. These men were aware of the compromises in the text they were signing. It was a staggered affair, reflecting the long ratification process from 1778 to 1781. They experienced its frustrations firsthand. Their endorsement stands as a testament to the powerful desire for union. Roger Sherman of Connecticut played a unique role in the American founding. He possessed a quiet influence and practical wisdom. Sherman is the only person to have signed all 4 great state papers of the United States. Sherman played a central role in devising the Great Compromise. Roger Sherman's story is a reminder that history is often shaped by the steady work of dedicated individuals. His journey mirrors the nation's path from a loose league to a more perfect union. The Articles of Confederation are often remembered as a failure. The government it created was too weak, leading to economic instability, social unrest, and a loss of international respect. However, to label the Articles simply as a failure is to miss their profound and essential importance in the American story. They were a necessary first step in the nation's political development, born from fears of centralized power. The experience of living under the Articles was a crucial, if painful, education. Without this first-hand experience, it is highly unlikely that the states would have ever consented to the Constitution. They were a vital stepping stone, and the Constitution was written in direct response to the specific problems of the Articles. Though the Articles of Confederation were officially replaced by the United States Constitution over 2 centuries ago, their legacy has not entirely vanished. The principles and debates that animated that first government continue to resonate in American political life like faint but persistent echoes from a distant past. The central tension that defined the Articles, the struggle between a strong central government and the rights of individual states, was not permanently resolved in 1787. It remains one of the most enduring and fundamental themes in American political discourse. This ongoing debate over federalism is a direct and living legacy of the nation's first constitution. Every time there's a political argument about the proper role of the federal government versus the states, we hear the echoes of the debates that shape the Articles. When states challenge federal laws on issues ranging from healthcare and education to environmental regulations, they are drawing from the same well of state sovereignty that gave life to Article 2 of the Confederation. This belief that the states are not mere administrative units of the national government, but are powerful, distinct political communities with their own rights and interests, is a powerful current in American history that began with the firm League of Friendship. Furthermore, the Articles remind us of the deep-seated American skepticism of concentrated power. The revolutionary generation's fear of a distant, overbearing government is a sentiment that has resurfaced time and again throughout the nation's history. Movements that advocate for limited government, fiscal restraint, and a stricter interpretation of federal authority are, in some ways, the intellectual descendants of those who championed the Articles. The document stands as a powerful historical symbol of the belief that government should be kept as close to the people as possible and that its powers should be few and explicitly defined, a philosophy that continues to attract passionate adherents today. Ultimately, the story of the Articles of Confederation is a vital lesson in the difficult, ongoing process of self-government. It teaches us that creating a nation is not a single event, but a continuous journey of trial, error, and adaptation. The Articles represent a critical chapter in that journey, a time when Americans first grappled with the profound challenge of balancing freedom with order and states' rights with national unity. By studying this often overlooked document, we gain a deeper appreciation for the Constitution that replaced it and a better understanding of the fundamental debates that have shaped and continue to shape the American experiment.